Okay, thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to this important conversation, Louder Than Words. My name is Angie Sims, and I'd like to introduce you to our esteemed guest and moderator. Our moderator, Mark Willis, is the founder of ParQuest Consulting, whose mission is to help firms level the playing field for Black and Brown financial professionals. I have the honor of welcoming our guest, beginning with one of America's most profound and nationally recognized voices of financial literacy, co-CEO and president of Ariel Investments, Mellody Hobson. Thank you for joining us, Mellody.
Thank you for having me.
Reverend Dr. Calvin Bus the third, is the pastor of the iconic Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, New York City, and president of the State University of New York College at Old Westbury. Thank you for being here, Dr. Butts.
Thank you.
International influencer, diplomat, founder of Charismatic Speakers, and faith leader, the Honorable Ambassador Suzan Johnson Cook, also known as Sujay. Thank you so much, Ambassador Sujay, for joining us.
Thank you, my pleasure.
And Ana Duarte McCarthy, international thought leader, former Chief Diversity Officer for Citigroup Global Workforce Diversity for over 20 years, and current Director of Development for Forte. Thank each of you for joining us in this important conversation today.
Thank you, Angela.
This broadcast is also being broadcast live on the ParQuest Consulting's YouTube page, and we will accept questions at the end should time allow. Until that time, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat. Know that all listeners will be on mute. Thank you so much. I will now turn it over to our moderator, Mark Willis.
Thank you so much, Angela. And I want to welcome our esteemed panel and guests. And I think we have a very powerful panel to talk about a very important topic and conversation. And I just have to say that I remember the morning of May 22nd and waking up on Memorial Day and going to Twitter and seeing that Central Park is trending. And I watched the video of the dog walker in Central Park weaponize the fear that African-American men in particular have with the police. And I thought to myself, this is amazing that, because it was so intentional. But then that same day, I remember watching the George Floyd video, and this deep sadness came to me. My eyes were starting to tear up as I watched, and partially, I'm not unaware and I'm not unfamiliar with police brutality, particularly in African-American communities. I grew up in a housing project and lived there for the first 19 years of my life. But to watch that particular video and the callousness of taking a human life without caring one bit, hands in his pocket, just really shook me to my core. And even after the person either close to or actually taping said that he's not moving. Did you just kill him? There was no effort to see if he was still alive. And so that really shook me. And it was different than all the other times I've watched police brutality and witnessed it. And then the reaction and the outrage from America and the diversity of that outrage gave me hope. And it felt like, and it feels like this time is different. So the first thing I would like for you guys to talk about is the significance of this moment and in a historical context, because it really feels different this time. So Ana, I know that you have a perspective on this. Why don't you start?
Thank you, Mark. And it's a privilege to be among the panelists who are with us today and people who I've admired and known for a long time. A couple of things, like you, I felt outrage, sadness, discouraged watching the video because it was another terrible injustice in a long line and hundreds of years of injustice. So it just seemed to culminate in yet another moment. What happened then, and what we talked about, is I work in my space with undergraduate, early career, and MBA students, and in particular women of all backgrounds. And what I saw among our own community and around the world was a global outcry, and almost a perfect storm, because we're in the midst of an unprecedented time in a pandemic where people have been isolated, where there's been job loss, where jobs were rescinded. And so you had all these young, bright minds who coalesced across social media and poured that anger out into the streets. And that too has given me hope. We've had a number of town halls and forums with young women, in particular women of color, Black women, who've said that not only do they want to see sustainable change, they're going to demand that from their employers and their communities. And, when you get to be like myself, a little long in the tooth, I guess, whatever metaphor we'll say, we're looking for that leadership to emerge and to carry forward. And I'm encouraged by that. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about what needs to be different, because, we've had some of these moments before. It's certainly those of us who marched in Washington several times, more recently in 2017 in the Women's March. It's to demand change. So we have to find ways to make this sustainable and to ensure that whatever we do, and a lot of people are saying, what do we do, has to have sustainable, continuous action. And so, again, I'm just really pleased to be here. This is such an important conversation, and I look forward to hearing from the others as well.
Well, I do thank you for the invitation to be with you and with my co-panelists, who are people I admire greatly. I reacted first as a mother of 2 adult Black men, particularly when George Floyd cried out for his mother, which was, it just was a range of emotions that shook through, I think, every Black mother on this earth. But it's also following 2 weeks prior seeing Ahmaud Arbery actually being hunted down. And we didn't know where to put those emotions. It was the George Floyd death that allowed the world to see what we have seen all of our lives. As a Black mother, we have the talk, the prayer, and the cry with our children. Used to be the birds and the bees, but it's, as Black men, what you have to do differently, what you have to do when cops stop you, what you have to do when you're driving while Black, shopping while Black, working while Black. And so the range of emotions as a mother first came forward. And, as a boomer, we used to have this song, the revolution will not be televised, but technology is the great game changer now, because this revolution is televised. And it was because of a 17-year-old young woman filming George Floyd's death that the world really got on board with Black America. And so as a mother and as a professional, I'm pleased to see the peaceful protest, but it also took me back to the original March on Washington, where I was in the basement of Abyssinian Baptist Church, Reverend Dr. Church. Adam Clayton Powell was the pastor then, and we watched our parents on a black and white screen as they marched in Washington with Dr. Martin Luther King, and we were in what was called a freedom school, so that we were learning the historical significance of why they were marching, what civil rights meant, and why we as children were born into this movement and what we had to do going forward. So now to see the next generation pleases me, that what our parents marched for, now they're marching for this generation and the generations who will follow.
Okay, Mellody, just so you know, we're just going to be just a straight conversation. So everybody can chime in when they're ready.
Great.
But I saw
I'll chime in then, and I'll say that clearly, like everyone else, it's horrifying. And there's no question that you can't watch 8 minutes and 46 seconds of someone being murdered and not be horrified. And if you can, then I have some questions about your humanity and empathy. So that's the first piece. It's horrifying. I was horrified. But at the same time, like many of us in our community, we know this happens every single day without any cameras. I was horrified, but not surprised. And as I thought more and more about that feeling, those dual feelings that I was having at the time, I realized that that's how I always feel. And that's really a strange thing, that we've been conditioned to feel that way. We know the injustice that goes on every single day in this country, every single day, every single minute, in all corners of our society. And we also know at the same time that it has been going on for a long time. And yet when we see it, we are still, again, taken aback. And this was obviously what King thought would be so important to the last important movement that we had in civil rights. I think this is a new movement. The last movement we had in civil rights in the 60s, where he wanted to put the injustice and the horror on camera for Americans to be able to see what was happening in the segregated South, and to be able to see young people trying to just sit at a lunch counter and having dogs or hoses put on them to show America this is not right. Now, of course, just a small device in our pockets allows us to see this on a daily basis. And these videos are now, I think, a wake-up call to America, not Black America, not brown America, but white America, of what has been going on that we know all too well.
Thank you.
These are all great statements, and we've seen movements like this, even internationally, across many decades and centuries. I go back to the conference in Bandung in 1955, when the only African-American representative was Adam Clayton Powell Jr. And this was a coming together of Asian and African nations that were just emerging. Of course, as was referenced, we've seen it in the civil rights movement. And that movement helped to project by via of the cathode ray tube television on the screen. It made many, Ted Koppel is one I can think of, many great reporters even greater because they covered it. And it revealed to America and the world the hypocrisy of this nation. And of course, the destruction, the killing, the murder of African-American men and women is nothing that is new to us in all generations. And Brian Stevenson has made that so graphic in his museum down in Montgomery. If museum is even the right word. So I think this time is a different time, but it is not a unique time. We've seen these kinds of explosions of anger before. One of the earliest explosions that I can think of in history was Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner. That was an explosion of anger. And as Frederick Douglass has pointed out, whether ours be a moral revolution or whether it be an actual physical revolution, there's going to be a revolution among us when we see these horrors. And it is good that more and more whites, as the Quakers did, and they're speaking out against slavery, are joining with us in this effort. And it is good when you have in the Civil War people who recognize that something like slavery or racial injustice or any kind of injustice is wrong. And so therefore morally outraged, you know, as we died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. Our God is marching on. So this time, while it feels unique to some and it's different to others, when you compare it historically, it's really not that different. And what we have to challenge is white male supremacy in high places. And that has not radically changed. It has not changed much in the leadership of our cities, though some. And we're seeing more and more African-American mayors. It has not changed much in the leadership of our government, though we had an unusual happening in the election of Barack Obama. But the control of power still resides among white males. Now we're chipping away at it incrementally. But when all else fails to organize the people, poor people, Black and white in this land, then conditions will. That's Marcus Garvey. And for us as African Americans, we have to seize this moment to really challenge white America. Protests are important. People in the street are important. And that should continue if it can. But protest at the corporate level, if we look at the boards of many of our corporations, there are not many blacks. And the blacks who are there are well chosen. They're not going to rock the boat too much. And they've been well trained in institutions that don't necessarily profess to be moral leaders or leaders in the change of America. And, you know, I was told by people who are deeply rooted in corporate America, who happen to be African Americans, that African Americans of a certain age, African Americans of a certain occupation or calling, are not necessarily the good representatives on these boards, even though Leon Sullivan, who was one of the pioneers in this effort, happened to have been a black minister and happened to have been in a key place when it was important for liberation in places like South Africa. I've seen corporate executives pledge their support to these kinds of efforts. Yet when it comes to particularly banks and others, though there are exceptions, when it comes to putting the money in the places where we need it so that we can really press for equality, it's not there. It's there, but only in sufficient amounts to quell, shall we say, the bubbling up of outrage. But when you really need something that will build affordable housing, something that will change the nature of our schools, something that will really inform, you have to recognize power concedes nothing without a demand. That's Frederick Douglass. It never has and it never will. And those who are in power are not just going to give it up. They'll give a little here, a little there. But when it really gets down to the essence of the system that sustains them, that's when the people have to rise up. And I believe that's what got Dr. King killed. Now, in this moment, as outraged as we were with the death of George Floyd, think about the millions, hundreds of thousands of people who watched the lynching and the castrating of our brothers and the mutilation of our sisters. This is, my beloved friends, a question of how long that the people will really put up with this. And our cry is for revolution. And while I agree with my sister that the revolution will not be televised, the true revolution won't be televised. It will be ugly, it will be brutal, unless America comes to its senses. And with the man we have in the White House now, that does not look like it's going to happen. And we are compromising yet again with Joe Biden. It's yet another compromise. Joe Biden may be the lesser of the evils, but he has certainly been a part of the system that has been oppressing Black people for hundreds of years. So, you know, we continue to press. We continue to protest. We can continue to not appease, but shake, if you will, power in this nation. And we cannot accept that white people will choose who they will let on their boards and who they will let. And that demand, as unpopular as it may be, well, Reverend, but you know, we got to work with them. We got to, as unpopular as it may be, must be one that we continue to press. You can't have rain without thunder and lightning. You can't have crop without the terrible roar of its waters. This is not new with me. Of course, you know, I quote the great masters, the great rhetoricians, the great fighters for progress. That, of course, again, is Frederick Douglass. And I think, listen, I think clearly about the big brouhaha that was made about the most recent publication of the biography of Frederick Douglass. And I think about the people who promoted that and who called me. Yet many of them found themselves at the behest of the people they work for. And few of them are engaged deeply in the bowels of the Black community. So there's a reckoning coming. And people are calling now, especially whites are calling, what should I read? What should I read? Read The Choice by Samuel Yett. Read The Debt by Randall Robinson. Read The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. These are things that really begin to get at the shaking of the foundation. And every major leader who has talked about really shaking the foundation, and not necessarily just being appeased by it. Everyone, and I'll start with the one that I call Lord Jesus. Remember, he got nailed to a tree. John the Baptist got his head cut off. Martin Luther King Jr. was shot down on the Memphis balcony. Malcolm X was slaughtered in New York at the Audubon Ballroom. Power concedes nothing without a demand. Agitate, agitate, agitate. Translated, protest, protest, protest. Challenge, and don't stop, because that's the only way we're going to make progress. And those who hold the power are not going to give it up.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Butts, Reverend Dr. Butts. Let's talk about what individuals can do, and you touched on this a bit with activism, but let's talk about what individuals can do to push this moment forward, because I get a lot of questions from our allies, and what should I be doing? What, how can I help that would be significant? So what are you guys' thoughts on that?
Well, for me,
In the places,
okay. For the questions I'm being asked are not what can I read, but what can I do? And for one of the things, I think partnerships and collaboration are really important. For us, we've formed the Global Black Women's Chamber of Commerce, which is the first chamber that's going to focus solely on Black women-owned businesses, because historically, the places that we are free are in home ownership and in entrepreneurship. And so what we're trying to do is close that wealth gap and create intergenerational wealth, so that we're not asking for the check, but we're actually writing the check. And that's one form of response. So we've just collaborated with one organization that's going to help us to build 25 Black women businesses, distributorships of PPE equipment. So that's a start, and that's a place where we can have our own power, where we're not actually depending on others. So that's one response. And I think, you have young people protesting, but you also have to have some people at the table for whom our parents protested. And so we have to do something with whatever gains we do have. And that's one of the responses that we're doing.
Yeah, I first of all, I could listen to the Reverend all day. So thank you for that narrative, because it's so important. One of the things that's interesting is that in many organizations that I've been speaking to, there's clearly a reckoning and an awakening that things need to change. And very often the go-to is to the senior Black executive to say, what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. And these folks are exhausted, because as others have said, they're being asked, what should I read? How are you feeling? A friend of mine said that she replied to a colleague and said, I've been Black my whole life, not just last week. So there's an element of everyone needs to be part of this. So this can't be put on one particular community to make things different. And there are times when I've seen the what should we do go right to the senior Black executive, the diversity head. And that is something we all need to examine, because when those decisions are made to go to one or two people, there's a huge cultural tax put on that person. Many of them have very senior roles already. They are the only one in that role, and potentially the only person who is Black or brown in that role. So there's already a lot of visibility around them. And now they're leading 400 years of change in a company. So one of the things that is really critical is that to examine what companies have been doing. Many put out eloquent statements, but for many people, what's behind the words? What is going to be different? We talked about board composition, senior management composition. Those things have been focused on for many years by companies. Yesterday, I read that only 6% of companies actually report what their diversity demographics are. And so that's part of the challenge, is that there are policies and practices But if nothing really changes, we're going to be in the same place 20 years from now, where there's care and concern and what should we do, but no real movement, no real advancement. And that's what people are frustrated with. And I feel like that's part of the passion and the anger of these young people. They've worked so hard to get where they are, and now they're looking at systems that they feel, whether it's the metaphorical and horrific knee on a neck, but will they have a chance? Is there really an opportunity for them, or are they going into a system that's already just not going to work and support them? So that's a challenge, and Mark and I talked about that the knee jerk has been, what should we do? And they're looking at the same individual to do that, and frankly, that can't work. It can't be one individual, one leader changing everything alone.
If I could just, respond to a couple things. I think there's a turn in this conversation to the corporation and the accountability of the corporation, the accountability of the individual. And I start out with the fact that we're all accountable. Let's just, at every level of society, we're all accountable, Black, white, brown, etc., all levels of our society. And the accountability obviously increases the more power and influence and leadership role that you have. And so I start with this accountability issue, and there is this conversation always about the Black executive or the brown executive in corporate America who is to carry more of a load, or the Black or brown entrepreneur like myself who ends up having 5 jobs. You can't just run your business. Yeah. I can't just do what I do because I have to be on call on these issues, or if I'm on a board, be on call to the minority employees inside of the company, which I feel is my responsibility, that maybe the white board member doesn't have that same responsibility. But I start off with the fact of a really big, important point. Whenever I think about this load or, quote, being exhausted, I tell myself a very simple thing. I am not in a field picking cotton. My ancestors had it much harder than I do. And that's not because I don't work extraordinarily hard and put in the time and energy, but it is just different. And so starting off with the fact that that is not the case in terms of our reality today, I think it is incumbent upon us to really understand we must take up this mantle, and there are no excuses. It's hard to be the only one, but what else is new? To the point that you said, how long have you been Black? The second thing that I think, to Reverend Dr. Butts' comment, is that Dr. Reverend, I think, is to really make the point, and I've been a fan of yours for so many years, and we met in the halls of a corporation, is that those of us who are in those rooms, we are accountable to making sure that there is change. And so we started a conference almost 20 years ago called the Black Corporate Directors Conference, and the goal of the conference is to have Fortune 500 directors understand their role in making sure that civil rights is in the boardroom. That conference was started with my firm, Ariel, John Rogers, my co-CEO, and myself, and Charles Tribbett from Russell Reynolds. And we have actually put together what we call a call to action for those board members to help them understand their responsibility, and we call it the 3 Ps, so that there's actual specifics as opposed to anecdotes or just working on these things. And we say the 3 Ps are people, purchasing, and philanthropy. And at the people level, we say count. I love the saying, math has no opinion. Count. You have to count all levels of the organization. You're not allowed to lump all the ethnicities together and have this umbrella of ethnicities and gender. What does it look like with African Americans, Latinx, Asian, etc.? Go through the organization from the top, from the board all the way down to the lowest ranks of the organization. And do those numbers line up with society? Are people underrepresented as you go up those ranks or not? And then what are you going to do about them? What are you going to do about them? Incentives. You get what you incent in corporate America. You must set targets. People get all upset about targets. And they're like, you want us to put in quotas. There's a difference between a target and a quota. And targets we are used to in corporate America. We have earnings targets. We have production targets, profitability targets. It is a part of the DNA of corporate America. So why not have targets around diversity? We need those. And you can't hit a target unless you set one. So we need targets, and we need an incentive to back up the ultimate outcomes, because you get what you incent in corporate America. So if your pay is on the line to hit a number, I promise you the people in corporate America will start from their own enlightened self-interest, figuring out a way to make it work. So that's at people. Purchasing. We think the term supplier diversity and procurement, that's so last century. We should be talking about business diversity. And just like we count with people, we need to count the corporate spend across all aspects of spending. Our economy is a service economy, and the whole idea of procurement is based upon a manufacturing economy. 2/3 of GDP in this country is service related. And so the areas of corporate spend that we need to pay particular attention to and make sure we're inclusive are professional services, financial services, technology, to make sure Black and brown entrepreneurs are represented in that spend. And that can change the game in a big way in terms of minority businesses and the livelihoods that they have. People are always talking about access to capital in terms of entrepreneurs. And John Rogers and I say access to customers makes all the difference. If you have customers, you can take that to a bank and say, this is these are the revenues I expect. But if you don't have customers, capital won't do you much good. And then last but not least, philanthropy. Now here's the problem right now. This is the tail that's wagging the dog. There's so much virtue signaling going on right now with corporations wanting to suggest and show that they are aligned around these issues of economic inequality and improving the outcomes for people of color. And so they're doubling down on philanthropy. I'm all for that. However, you will not fix society without fixing your own house. It starts from within, not from without. And at the end of the day, as I like to tell my white colleagues, Black people, we want to send our own kids to school. We actually don't want scholarships for our kids. Now, I don't mean that in a pejorative way or in an ungrateful way, but saying over the long term, our goal is to be able to support our own families and our own community. And the way to do that is to create economic opportunity for individuals. Right now, 50% of working African-American adults are unemployed. That doesn't work. That won't work long-term in terms of creating a society or having a system that works for everyone. And the last part, and I'm sorry to go on so long, why should this time be different? If you just, again, go back to enlightened self-interest. This time, the protests were in city centers. This time, this wasn't about, burning down a Black community or us being upset and hurting our own property. We took it to other places. I'm not for violence in any way, but I understand the outrage and the rage, especially when you're in a situation where your children are potentially hungry. And so now that rage has come into city centers, businesses understand this is not good for business. And so they are more incented, back to incentives, to be able to find solutions that ultimately lead to better outcomes because it's affecting their pocketbooks.
And I would agree with some of that, but I would say that they are incentivized within a certain frame, within a certain context. They are incentivized as long as it does not threaten their power and they can control it. You see, I argue that corporate America, banks, all of it, built on the back of slavery, of course. And the monies that they have, that's our money. That's our sweat equity. And it needs to be reinvested, not at a level that compares with their configuration of what society ought to look like, or how much should go here, or how much should go there. It needs to be freed up. And it needs to be in the hands of men and women who are on the ground, working in the bowels of their community, building, and a good point, though I'm going to refute it in a moment, housing, affordable housing, daycare centers, improving public education, not trying to take public education entrepreneurial. And in the boardroom, the men and women there ought to be arguing these points at the risk of the jobs, at the risks of the positions. Because if this is going to be a change moment, you're absolutely right. It has to absolutely change. And that change is forced. Look, historically speaking, slavery would not have ended without the Civil War. And I'm not a big advocate of violence either. Defensive, it would just not have ended. In fact, it would have stayed in place. And so therefore, there is a lot of pressure on us in the boardrooms, on the individuals who have somehow made it to certain positions. Huh? There's a lot of pressure. I'm president of a school. So, and it is overwhelming, but that's what's expected. That's what's expected, and that's what's necessary. And whether it's Charles Hamilton Houston working himself to death, Thurgood Marshall battling up through unimaginable challenges, and any number of men and women, the whole system has to change. And I'm saying that it's really not going to change until people are just willing to give up everything for struggle. For example, economic sanctions in South Africa. The primary corporate response to that was, you don't want to do that, because if we stop sending our monies in there and building up the industries there, the people will be poorer than they are now. Mandela said, are you kidding? Suffering under the circumstances we're under now, bring on the sanctions. And so I think we need to continue to struggle. I know I was present at one of your sessions in trying to increase the number of people of color on the boards. And I think it was an excellent attempt, and it should go forward. And the last thing I would say, diversity. It was Black at one time. It was a push for African Americans at one time. Now, I agree that everybody has benefited. When the walls of segregation came tumbling down and the civil rights movement, more people ran across that rubble than just Black people. But I'm unapologetically Black. We must ensure that that sweat equity returns to our community at the same level that it was taken out. And the leaders of these corporations are not going to do that, I don't think, without enormous pressure. And that's why I continue to say to the protesters, keep marching, keep knocking on doors, keep kicking, and keep saying those unpopular things. I want to support the efforts of working women who have been the salvation of many countries, really, especially African countries. When the women stand up, they can do marvelous things. But I also want us to realize how important this moment is. And it's a moment that really should not be controlled. We must continue to demand what is rightfully ours and say so. That's integrity. Say so, it's ours, it belongs to us. And you've stolen it. You've stolen it by killing. And one primary example is the so-called Indian. What does my brother have in the land that belonged to him or her or and her? What do they have? Reservations? They had treaties, people concerned. We cannot find ourselves in that position. And because of panels like this, we have a chance to say it loudly, though others will try to dampen it down. Because of the brothers and sisters in the street who are marching, Black and white, I will give the white people who join us in that, who are ontologically Black, moving forward. But I don't want to miss saying to all of us, you're right, Mellody, to all of us, that unless there is change, this country is going to go to hell.
I too would agree.
It really is. A few of us may rise to the top, but you can't let that cover up the rest of us who are on the bottom. And there are the poor whites down there too. These poor white people are struggling. They're struggling. And so that's our point. Sorry, Reverend.
You know, I do agree with you in terms of there needs to be a risk, but I would also say, Dr. Butts, just as we were going through seminary, there was always this divide between the scholarship and the praxis, and who, you know, we never really connected. And I would say to Mellody, for those who are not in corporate America, there's another word I would say P, another P is partnerships. And if I had to add a C to the change, it would be that there needs to be a connecting of the dots for those who are not in corporate America. And the way that that begins to happen for me is an entrepreneurship. My parents, unfortunately, had to pick cotton in this generation, but they rose and built wealth and now still have the longest running family-owned business in the Bronx, New York. But they had a rough beginning, and the only way that they were able to get free from systemic racism was to be able to own their own business. And so I would say for those who are in corporate America, and I was introduced to your boards also through Marion Hurd and others, is to make the connection with those who are not in corporate America, because that's how change really comes. We're the servant leaders on the streets from our churches, other institutions, but we never really have a chance to connect with corporate America. And if there's going to be change, then the voices that are servant leaders also need to be with the corporate board leaders. We need you at the table. We need you at the table. But I also feel you need us who are not at the table, because all of it comes together and converges for change to really happen.
So one thing I 100% agree with you on that. So first of all, remember, I've never worked in a large corporation. Right. I sit on a couple of corporate boards, but I'm an entrepreneur, came from Chicago, youngest of 6 kids, single mom. We can do the whole song and dance, which is very familiar to our community. So let's start with that. Right. But the one thing that I say and what we advocate for in a major, major way, and I love Brian Stevenson's points about this, is you have to have proximity. Mm-hmm. You will need African Americans in those boardrooms who have proximity to our community, or not removed from our community. I have proximity. I'm not removed from my community in any way. And diversity, which is a word that has obviously been pummeled in so many ways in terms of its meaning. Mm-hmm. Diversity, this concept, has been watered down at times because there's this sense, to your point, Doctor, that just having a Black person in the room solves the problem. That is not true. Right. Everyone is not advocating in the same way. Everyone is not owning their Blackness in the same way or comfortable in it. Everyone is not as unapologetic as you, and hopefully I am trying to be every single day as I walk around the earth, and making sure that we are of service to a community that has less than we have. Right. For reasons that are no fault of their own. And I recognize in every single way, not being defensive, how the universe had to come together to conspire to create the opportunities that I have. It was a miracle, and miracles are not a way to lead a society and to create equality for everyone. Yeah. And so understanding that, and I use the example all the time, Clarence Thomas is Black. Right. But, he's not necessarily fighting for the issues that we know are so important to moving the needle forward for Black Americans.
Let me give you an example.
I was going to add to something quickly, is that I think just adding to the context on the narrative of diversity, that's a really important point. And I've been in this space for 35, 40 years. And as was said earlier, this was a conversation that came out of racial inequity. And over the years, it's been homogenized. It's been made comfortable for people. There's a level of complacency around what we talk about in some places when we talk about diversity. And there's and to the point of diverse perspectives, to make everyone part of the conversation. And we see that in how we track and hold accountability. So that's a really important point, is that as companies and other communities start to put their arms around diversity, I've been involved in community work as well, very recently, where there's been a real pushback around ensuring everyone is part of this conversation. While everyone can be part of change, we have to face and look at where the issues are. And that's what needs to be looked upon and held accountable to. And when we start to create it and make it I think comfortable for everyone, we're not going to be disruptive. And that's a real concern I have, is that I see that the initial let's do something is moving into let's make sure we don't rock the boat. Well, we need to rock the boat, and we have to continue doing that.
Let me make a specific point here. I have recommended, as a result of being with Mellody and the organization, a number of African Americans to boards. Very qualified, been in corporate America in different positions, but are very much attached to the community, some members of our churches, and even had major governmental executives make the recommendation. Nothing. Not even a response that says why. That says why. So that's one level. The other thing is, we have to use the resources that we have. So if an African American is on a board, absolutely. If a corporate executive says, look, I want to help one of Dr. Sujay's firms, get on their feet, we have to take what we can get as a result of our struggle. But we never give up the struggle saying the whole system is wrong. It is built on exploitation. And it will not change until we are just absolutely determined in not taking, a little here, a little there. Why would a person in power disrupt the system that supports them? Take the police. You saw it, Mark, you saw the knee on the neck, and we all saw the other atrocities that are taking place. The system, a black officers are often involved in some of these killings. And so it's a corrupt system in itself. I don't believe you should throw them out. I don't believe that we can live in a society without the police. But there has to be substantial change at the top. Now you're seeing more and more African Americans as leaders of police departments. But many of them have to throw up their hand. They can't do it. They don't know what to do because the political system continues to support this kind of behavior. And why wouldn't it? Because it is supported primarily by those corporations and businesses that thrive in this kind of exploitive society. And I think I understand the struggle, and I know what we have to put up with, sometimes what we have to go along with, sometimes what we have to compromise with. But the essence of this thing is, it has fundamentally got to change. There's no compromising with it. And until it does, whether it's the police, whether it's corporate America and the church has to fundamentally change. Because the theology that we deal with is just recently becoming a theology that is informed by the experiences and the history of people of color. Cotton Mather said it's all right to be a slave and you can be a Christian too. That goes back centuries. The church is as much responsible for this exploitation, and Martin Luther King recognized that when he wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail. And so therefore, and black ministers as well as white still put forth this warped, bastardized theology. So you're right, all of us have a responsibility in this, and this makes this conversation so very important. But it's almost like the black family living in a white neighborhood, seeing another black family coming in and say, oh, they're moving in. They are moving in. We have got to demand that these corporate executives that we have a hold of, we cannot allow them. We must stay on them at risk of our own jobs, at risk these churches, at risk of our own ministers. And say, look, this stuff is warped. It's been warped since they first came and got us as slaves and brought us into the wilderness of North and South America. And 1619, the Peace in the Times, more discussion. My sister, Alexander, help me quick.
Jill Alexander.
Say it again.
Jill, you're talking Jill Alexander?
No, not
Michelle
Jill.
Alexander.
Michelle, thank you.
Alexander.
I'm getting older, folks.
We all
Michelle
are.
Alexander.
Yeah.
Michelle Alexander. You know, with the new Jim Crow, all of this is revelatory. And so challenging in a few places. Let me start with the church. So I don't,
yeah, I was going to
start
ask
with
about the church. Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah, the church. Our theology is warped. Jim Cone was telling us that.
Mm-hmm.
Liberation theology is extremely important. Womanist theology is important.
Very much so.
All of this comes out of our unique experience as Black people in America. And taking a look at John Johnson, taking a look at Reginald Lewis, thank you. Reginald Lewis, taking a look at those men and women, Madam C.J. Walker, Alelia Walker, taking a look at them and what they brought and what they had. These are the things that should influence us as we sit in these corporate boardrooms. Not what will our investors think? How can we increase this profit share? Sure, that's important to the corporate, but then what do you do with it in terms of making an overall impact?
Yeah. To your point of law enforcement, I was police chaplain during the Amadou Diallo uprising, which was a very awkward place to be. Certainly people were outside marching. And I remember Reverend Sharpton and I having a discussion. Some of us needed to be inside because the racism inside the department was equal. But being—
is.
Yeah. So to be one voice in the midst of that, it, cannot substantiate change. You can go to the police commissioner's office on a particular event, but you can't substantiate change. But to your point about churches, these are the first movements really not born out of the church in our contemporary history. So how do you think churches need to change to influence what is happening now? What are the specifics for you and those who are clergy leaders now? What do you think needs to happen?
One of the things that I said earlier on is that the church inherited the mantle, or the blueprint, I called it, of Dr. King. He certainly, without question, came out of the church. Mm-hmm. And that blueprint said that we were entering into, generally, I've been to the mountain, I've seen the promised land. We inherited the blueprint and we tried to build on that. And our building was to demand, first of all, that the money in the banks, the money in America was our sweat equity. We built it. We literally built Wall Street and figuratively built it. So our demand was righteous. Therefore, we wanted the 40 acres and a mule. We also want reparations, and we want them in the sense of the investing in our communities. We were fairly, I think, successful in that, in the sense that we revived a community, a Harlem community, that was literally faith-based. We cooperated with many corporations to draw some of that money into the communities, not as much as we would have wanted, but enough to build some housing, to build schools, to do those kinds of things. Today, I think, first of all, we've got to start by telling the truth about our faith and its origins in the bowels of Africa. I think we've got to start telling the truth that we are original Hebrews, the Jewish people, the African American, well, not American, but African. We've got to talk about our Holy Land as being Ethiopia, where the Ark of the Covenant is. We've got to begin to talk about Jesus as a true revolutionary. His mother said, he will bring down the mighty. We've got to start really recalling what is uniquely ours and exercising that, because it has been influential in the building of this nation, really, historically and culturally. And I think the church has that major responsibility. Christianity, primarily in the West, was Constantine trying to make a compromise and really taking over the religion. And to have the Catholic Church and slave ships named Jesus, the church has got a lot to repent for.
Yeah.
And and the exploitation of women.
Yes.
And in some of this, you know, I have to cry out like David, Lord, have mercy on me, you know, for I have sinned. But I think it's the wrestling with this and the constant, unapologetic demand and calling out the shortcomings. I really am, you know, of our churches. We call our prosperity ministry all the time. It's a ripoff. And so, and, you know, when I talk about the banks, how difficult it is for a small business person to get a loan. When I talk about corporations, you know, I have to talk about some of them have invested more, to the point where it really begins to represent something like reparations. And the exploitation of Africa, you talked about internationally, Brother Willis, the exploitation of African nations and Asian nations. And the only great Black politician that I think we have had to date is still Adam Clayton Powell Jr. So these are the kinds of things that we really have to, and it's only in sessions like this, Mark Willis, it's only in sessions like this that we can openly talk about it. I love everybody on the panel. I think they're wonderful people and have demonstrated across the years. But we have to wrestle not only with the larger system, but with each other in love. That's one of the great contributions of Jesus. I love you all in love. And as this conversation expands, more and more of us will see, I think, change. And I think change for the good. I'm very hopeful. If you ever run across a minister who's not hopeful and optimistic, get away from him as fast as you can.
I like, we're coming up on the hour, but I'd like for each of you to take a minute, well, take 30 seconds to say, what metrics would you be looking for to see if we are making progress and how much progress we're making? Pick one metric that you think is the most important to look at in terms of whether we're having success.
I'd like to see the number of young Black men killed by Black men drop drastically from 100 and so across one weekend in Chicago to maybe 5 or none. That would be a metric that would make me think that change is coming.
I'd like to see the wealth statistics of Blacks versus whites become equal. They're dramatically different. And until those numbers move, you're going to have civil unrest.
I too agree with both of those. The less killing of Black men by Black men, close the wealth gap, and that we become equal, and that more Black women become business owners.
I agree with all, and I would add that many companies have metrics around employee satisfaction, and you're able to look at that by race. And there was often a significant gap for Black men and women around, I have an equal opportunity for growth and advancement. I'd like to see that gap close. And then I know that people are being judged on their potential and their performance, and that we have really made some change, because there's been a gap there for a long, long time.
So those, I agree with all of you. The wealth gap, certainly the Black on Black killing, the corporate representation. I would probably add this whole issue of transparency. You know, I grew up in the wealth management business, and the wealth management business is notorious. Probably the investment business at large is notorious for the lack of representation. And I would say the biggest wealth managers, population of African-American advisors is about 1% to 2%, probably more like 1% to 1.5%. When they start publishing their numbers, as Mellody suggested that one of the corporate executives was putting it all out there, when they start publishing their numbers and say, I know this is not good. We're going to do better. And you can hold me accountable to that statement. And we're going to post our numbers from here on out. I think we will start to make some progress.
Mark, can I say one last thing?
Sure. Yes.
I'm a graduate of a historically Black college and university. The name of that college is Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia. I just want everybody on the panel to know that. One of the things that would be a great metric, we won't be able to save them all, but would be to see enormous investment by those who have their hands on capital into the salvation of many of our HBCUs. That would be tremendous. I saw Julius Rosenwald. He was one of the founders of Sears Roebuck. He invested in HBCUs, and many of our leaders in terms of the Black community are graduates of these institutions. That would continue a huge tradition of providing leadership for change. Howard University, Tuskegee, Morehouse, Spelman, these schools could, I think, help carry on this conversation with the quality of people that you have on this panel. I had to get that in, or else I think I would have been run out of the country.
Yeah, I know that many of you on the panel have time constraints, so we're going to wrap it up here. I would just say that I am very hopeful for the young people. I've lived all my life trying to figure out how to play the cards I was dealt. And that's been my mantra, play the cards which you're dealt. But these young people say, hey, just turn up the whole Monopoly game. Just flip the table up. Let's start with a new deck of cards and make sure the game is not rigged. And I applaud them for that. And if for the first time in my life, I think that we have an opportunity to do that. That we have an opportunity to turn the table over and start the game on a much fairer level. And I'm hopeful for my kids that that will come to fruition. But it's been an incredible conversation. I want to thank you all. I apologize to the audience because there were a number of chat questions and questions and answers. We just run out of time. And this is the first of hopefully many conversations that we'll have in the future. And I'm hoping that it will take place every second Thursday of the month. And we'll have, we might not be able to match the panel that we have today, an extraordinary viewpoints that they have, but we're going to do our best. So you can visit www.parquestconsultant.com. You can also visit www.markwillispresents.com to learn what's coming up next. I hope you enjoyed it. You can tell by the conversation that we're not monolithic. We have opinions that differ and are all valid. So again, thank you.
Thank you for having us, Mark.
Thank you.
Mark.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye.
Good to see all of you.
And the audience, we appreciate you coming out, and we'll end it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you all later.